Imagine this. You're in the middle of a game, and your opponent's pieces are closing in. Your king is tucked away, your pawns are set up, and your pieces are out. But somehow the position still falls apart when the pressure mounts. Here's the thing. Most defensive collapses are not sudden shocks. They follow patterns, structural cracks, misplaced pieces, or a single threat you never saw coming. There's a logic behind why these defenses break, and that logic is what we are going to uncover together. This video is a step-by-step guide to building a chess defense that does not collapse under pressure. That means going deeper than surface-level tips. It means understanding why king safety is a structural condition rather than a feeling, why pawn decisions echo through every phase of the game, and why the difference between a defense that holds and one that crumbles often comes down to a single habit of thinking most players never develop. We will start with the deep roots keeping your king truly safe, reading pawn structures as a defensive map, and making sure your pieces work together instead of standing alone. And yes, we'll also delve into the intricacies of the endgame, including rook endgames and isolated queen's pawn scenarios. By the time we are through, the positions that used to feel like they were slipping away will start to make a different kind of sense. Settle in. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Why defenses collapse. The common failure patterns. Defensive collapse in chess almost never looks like what it actually is. From the outside, it looks like a blunder. One move, one moment, and suddenly the position is gone. But if you go back and trace what actually happened, you will very often find that the real damage was done much earlier. In most cases, the final mistake is the last step in a sequence that had been building for several moves, sometimes many more than that. This is the first thing worth understanding about defensive failure. It is a process, not an event. The way it typically unfolds is gradual. The defender makes a small concession, something that seems manageable. Maybe a pawn gets pushed when it should stay put, or a piece retreats to a square where it does less work. On its own, that decision looks survivable. And it often is, in isolation. The problem is that one concession tends to invite another. The weakened pawn needs a piece to guard it. That piece is now tied down. The square it vacated becomes available to the opponent. Now a second concession is required to deal with that. Each step looks like a reasonable response to the current situation, but the cumulative effect is a position that has quietly become indefensible. What makes this pattern hard to see from the inside is that the position rarely feels critical until it suddenly is. There is a meaningful gap between the moment a position becomes objectively lost and the moment the player sitting at the board recognizes it as lost. By the time the attack lands and the material starts falling, the defender often experiences it as a sudden reversal. But the structural preparation for that reversal was already in place. The final tactic was just the execution of a plan that the position had been inviting for several moves. This is why players so often misidentify where their defense failed. They point to the last mistake, the move where the piece was dropped, or the king got caught. But the more instructive question is, when did the position first become difficult to defend? That earlier moment, the one where the structure started to bend, is where the real lesson lives. A single weak pawn is a useful example of how this compression works. A backward pawn, sitting on an open file, does not immediately lose the game. But it becomes a fixed target. The opponent can bring a rook to bear on it, then a second rook, then maneuver a piece to support an advance. The defender has to assign pieces to hold that pawn. Those pieces are now occupied. They cannot contest the center, cannot support the king, cannot participate in counterplay. The position around that one pawn gradually deteriorates, and eventually the pressure spreads to areas of the board that seem unrelated to the original weakness. That is the erosion pattern in its clearest form. Once you can recognize that pattern, the next step is learning to name the categories it falls into. Defensive positions tend to fail for three distinct reasons, and most collapses involve more than one of them at the same time. The first is structural weakness, defects in the pawn formation and the weakened squares that result from them. These problems matter because they are usually permanent. A weakened square does not fix itself, and the defender has to work around that compromise for the rest of the game. The second category is piece passivity. A piece becomes passive when it is assigned to guard something rather than to participate in the broader contest. A rook stuck on a blocked file, a bishop hemmed in by its own pawns, a knight retreated to the edge of the board to avoid an exchange. The problem with passivity is that it is self-reinforcing. A passive piece cannot help create counterplay, which means the defender has fewer resources to generate threats, which means the opponent can improve freely, which makes the passive piece even less relevant. The third category is king exposure. This means the king lacks adequate shelter. The pawns in front of it have been moved, or the king has not yet castled, or an open file has appeared that points directly at the king's position. Open files and open diagonals aimed at the king are particularly dangerous because they give the opponent's heavy pieces direct access. A rook on an open file adjacent to the king does not need to do anything dramatic. It simply sits there and multiplies the threat of every other piece in the attack. These three categories are not independent problems. They form a reinforcing system. Structural weakness tends to produce piece passivity, because pieces get assigned to defend weak pawns and squares, rather than operating freely. Piece passivity tends to worsen king exposure, because passive pieces cannot help close lines or challenge the opponent's attacking forces. And king exposure tends to accelerate everything, because once the king is under direct pressure, the defender has no time to address the underlying structural or coordination problems. The triangle closes on itself. This is why identifying one of the three categories should prompt you to look for the others. If you notice that a pawn structure has been compromised, the question is not just how to defend that weakness. The question is whether pieces are already becoming passive as a result, and whether that passivity is leaving the king with fewer defenders. Seeing one corner of the triangle is a signal to check the other two. Understanding the structural logic of collapse is genuinely useful. But there is a thinking pattern that allows structural failure to develop in the first place, and that pattern is worth examining directly. Most defenders play reactively. They wait for a threat to become concrete before responding to it. The opponent moves a piece. The defender identifies the immediate danger, and the defender addresses that specific danger. Then the opponent makes another threatening move, and the defender deals with that one. This is reactive defense, and it has a fundamental problem. It is always one tempo behind. When you respond to threats as they arrive, you are spending your moves on your opponent's agenda. Your opponent improves a piece and creates a threat. You neutralize the threat. Your opponent improves another piece and creates another threat. You neutralize that one too. But notice what is happening to your position while this is going on. You are not improving your pieces. You are not addressing your structural weaknesses. You are not organizing your king's shelter. You are simply absorbing pressure, move by move, while your opponent builds a more and more coordinated attack. The tempo deficit this creates is real and cumulative. After several exchanges of this kind, The attacker has a well-coordinated set of pieces pointing at a specific target, and the defender has a collection of pieces that are each doing a small defensive job and nothing else. The position has drifted into exactly the kind of structural and coordination failure described earlier, not because of a single bad decision, but because reactive thinking allowed each small concession to pass without being interrupted. The alternative is anticipatory defense. This does not mean guessing what the opponent will do. It means reading the structural intentions embedded in how the opponent's pieces and pawns are arranged. If the opponent has a rook on a half-open file pointed at your king's position, you do not need to wait for the rook to double before you address that file. The intention is already visible in the placement. If the opponent's knight is maneuvering toward a square that your pawn structure cannot challenge, you do not need to wait for the knight to arrive before you decide what to do about it. This is prophylaxis in practice. The practical habit behind it is straightforward. Before choosing your move, ask what your opponent is trying to do. Not just what they are threatening right now, but what they are building toward. Then ask whether your candidate move does anything to prevent that plan, or whether it simply ignores it. The defender who waits for a threat to become concrete before responding has already given up something important. By the time a threat is concrete, the opponent has already committed resources to it, already improved their position in the process of building it, and already forced the defender into a reactive posture. The structural damage is often already done. This connects back to the erosion pattern that opened this discussion. Reactive thinking is the mechanism through which small concessions accumulate. Each individual response to a threat looks reasonable, but the pattern of always responding, never anticipating, is what allows the opponent to direct the flow of the game. The position deteriorates not because any single response was wrong, but because the defender never stepped outside the reactive cycle long enough to interrupt the sequence. Recognizing collapse as a process, naming the three structural categories it tends to involve, and understanding how reactive thinking allows those categories to compound. These are the diagnostic tools that make everything else in defensive play legible. The question is not just what went wrong. The question is at which stage in the process the position first became difficult, and whether the thinking pattern in place at that moment was capable of seeing it. Chapter 2. King's Safety as a Non-Negotiable Foundation. Castling is a decision. What happens after castling is a different question entirely, and it is the more important one. Once the king reaches G1 or C1, many players treat the problem as solved. The king is off the center, the rook is connected, and attention shifts to the middle game contest. But the quality of that king's position is not determined by the act of castling. It is determined by the structure surrounding it, and that structure changes with every pawn move and every piece exchange that follows. For a white king on G1, the standard shield consists of the pawns on F2, G2, and H2. Each of those three pawns is doing structural work. They are blocking files, controlling squares in front of the king, and limiting the angles from which enemy pieces can approach. When all three are in place, and the king sits behind them, the position has a kind of baseline integrity. The opponent needs to do real work to crack it open. The moment one of those pawns moves or gets exchanged, that integrity changes in a way that is not proportional. Losing one pawn from the shield does not make the position slightly weaker. It makes it categorically more vulnerable, because the missing pawn creates a fixed entry point. A gap in the shield is a permanent feature of the position. Unlike a piece that can reposition, a pawn that has advanced or been traded away cannot come back. The square it was protecting is now a hole, and holes in front of the king tend to attract enemy pieces the way open squares anywhere else on the board do. Except here, the consequence of occupation is not just positional pressure, but direct danger to the king. This is why the f-pawn and g-pawn in a kingside shield are especially critical. The f-pawn, when advanced or exchanged, can expose the diagonal running toward the king and weaken the squares on either side of where it stood. The g-pawn, when missing, tends to open the g-file directly, giving enemy rooks and queens a straight path toward the king's position. The h-pawn is generally considered the most expendable of the three, which is why advancing it one square to create a flight square is often the least damaging option. But even the h-pawn, when pushed 2 squares or used as a target, can become a hook that the opponent grabs with their own pawn advance to pry open the position further. There is a subtlety here that intermediate players often miss. Evaluating the shield means evaluating not just the king's current square, but the squares the king might be forced to move to under pressure. If the king is on g1 and gets checked, where does it go? If f1 is covered by an enemy piece, and h1 leads to a back rank problem, the king may have no safe square at all. The shield is not just about where the king is sitting right now. It is about the entire local structure of squares the king depends on. A castled king is a structural anchor. The king's location shapes which files, diagonals, and squares carry defensive priority for the whole position. The defender has to think about that geometry, not just the immediate pawn in front of the king. The second major structural factor near the king is file control, specifically whether files adjacent to or directly in front of the king are open or closed. An open file near the king is an immediate problem. Both conditions matter, but they work differently. An open file near the king is an immediate problem. A rook or queen placed on that file is not exerting slow positional pressure. It is generating direct, concrete threats, checks, infiltration to the 7th or 8th rank, and access to invasion squares like g7 or h2. The difference between a rook on a closed file and a rook on an open file aimed at the king is the difference between a piece that is participating in the game and a piece that is pointing a weapon at a specific target. A half-open file is a latent version of the same problem. The attacker has no pawn on the file, but the defender does, and that defending pawn becomes a target. Heavy pieces can build pressure on it, and when the pawn is forced to exchange or is captured, the file opens completely. This is why defenders need to evaluate both categories simultaneously. The files that are already open represent immediate threats. The files that can be forced open through pawn exchanges represent threats that exist in potential, and those potential threats need to be part of the calculation now, not after the exchange happens. A common error at the intermediate level is to evaluate only the current file structure and miss the latent danger in a pawn tension the opponent can resolve at will. If the opponent controls whether and when a file opens near your king, they control the timing of the attack. That is a significant structural advantage, and it does not show up clearly in a static snapshot of the position. It only becomes visible when you ask the question, what happens if they exchange here? Defenders have a few options when facing open or half-open files near the king. Contesting the file with a rook prevents the attacker from establishing uncontested control. Moving the king off the file, sometimes combined with a move like f3 or f6 to reduce the file's relevance, can reduce the direct pressure. Closing the file by advancing a pawn or avoiding exchanges is another option, though it depends on the specific pawn structure and whether the defender has the tempo to make that move. The point is that file conditions near the king carry the same weight as the shield pawns themselves. The king with an intact pawn shield but an open file running straight toward it is not a safe king. The third structural question is when to advance a shelter pawn deliberately and when to leave the shield fixed. The most common reason to advance a shelter pawn is to create luft, typically by playing h3 for white or h6 for black. This is generally the least damaging version of the decision. Advancing the h-pawn one square weakens the g3 square to some degree, but it does not open a file and does not create dramatic diagonal exposure. The tension arises because creating luft is not free. Every shelter pawn advance creates a new weakness alongside the benefit it provides. Advancing the g-pawn weakens the squares on either side of where it stood and can open the g-file. Advancing the f-pawn creates holes on the e and g files and opens the diagonal running toward the king. The flight square the advance creates may solve one problem while introducing a different structural vulnerability, and whether that trade is worth making depends entirely on what pieces the opponent has available to exploit the new configuration. This is the governing principle. The decision to advance a shelter pawn is not about the pawn move in isolation. It is about whether the opponent's pieces are already trained on the squares that advance will weaken. If the opponent has a bishop aimed at the diagonal, the f-pawn is currently blocking. Advancing the f-pawn is not a safety measure. It is an invitation. If the opponent has no pieces capable of exploiting the newly weakened squares, the advance may be perfectly reasonable. The piece activity on both sides of the board is what determines whether the pawn move is sound. Strong players often delay creating luft until the opponent's attacking resources are clarified. The logic is straightforward. A premature pawn advance that creates a weakness before you know whether the opponent can exploit it gives the opponent information and options they did not previously have. Waiting to see how the opponent's pieces develop before committing to a shelter pawn advance is not passivity. It is the correct sequencing of decisions. The amateur habit runs in the opposite direction. A routine h3 or g3 gets played early as a precaution, without checking whether the newly weakened square becomes a landing spot for an enemy knight, or whether the diagonal just opened leads directly to the king. Advancing both the g-pawn and h-pawn in front of a castled king is a particularly common error, because it creates multiple entry points simultaneously. Each advance that seemed like a safety measure compounds into a position where the king has more gaps around it than it started with. The underlying principle connecting all three of these structural factors is that king safety is not a condition you establish once and then move on from. The shield can be intact at move 12 and compromised by move 18. A file that is closed in the opening can be forced open in the middle game. A pawn advance that seems harmless early in the position might turn into a significant liability as the opponent's pieces find their optimal squares. Each of these conditions changes as the game develops, which means the evaluation of the king's safety has to change with it. It's not just about whether you castled, it's about assessing the current structure around your king and recognizing how it has evolved over the last few moves. Chapter 3. Pawn Structure as the Skeleton of Defense. Pawn structure is not scenery. It does not sit in the background while the pieces do the real work. The pawns define the shape of the position. They determine where pressure will land, where pieces can settle, and what the defense is actually capable of holding. Once you start reading pawn formations through that lens, the whole board starts to communicate differently. The first thing to understand is what makes a pawn weakness genuinely dangerous rather than merely imperfect. A pawn weakness is a fixed point on the board. Pieces can relocate. A misplaced knight can reroute. A bishop on a poor diagonal can be repositioned over several moves. A weak pawn cannot do any of that. It sits where it sits, and if the opponent can aim pieces at it, it will remain under pressure for as long as the position lasts. That permanence is what makes structural weaknesses so costly relative to other kinds of positional problems. There are three canonical types. An isolated pawn has no friendly pawns on either adjacent file. That means no neighboring pawn can ever come to its defense. It must be protected entirely by pieces, and those pieces are then committed to a purely defensive task. A doubled pawn is two pawns of the same color stacked on the same file, usually the result of a capture. The front pawn of the pair cannot be supported by the rear pawn in the normal way, and the rear pawn is often blocked from advancing usefully. Doubled pawns also tend to leave one of the adjacent files weaker than it would otherwise be. A backward pawn is different from both of those. Its neighbors on adjacent files have advanced further, leaving it behind with no pawn support from the rear and no safe path forward. It usually sits on a half-open file where the opponent's rooks can line up against it directly. The distinctions between these three matter because the method of exploiting each one differs. An isolated pawn is most vulnerable when the opponent can place a piece directly in front of it, blocking it from advancing and anchoring the attack. A knight is particularly effective in this role because it can sit on the blockading square and still reach other parts of the board, staying active while maintaining the pressure. Once the blockade is in place, heavy pieces can be stacked on the file to increase the number of attackers faster than the defender can bring in reinforcements. A backward pawn is targeted differently. Because it sits on a half-open file, rooks and a queen can bear down on it from a distance, and the square directly in front of it tends to become a stable outpost for the opponent's pieces. Doubled pawns invite pressure on the front pawn of the pair along the file it occupies. The nuance that matters most here is this: a weakness only becomes a real problem when the opponent can actually station a piece on it or in front of it and sustain that pressure. A theoretically weak pawn that is well protected by pieces and surrounded by active counterplay is a manageable situation. The weakness becomes critical when the opponent can increase pressure faster than the defender can mobilize adequate protection. That is the threshold. Not the existence of the weakness, but the opponent's ability to exploit it concretely. The common mistake is evaluating pawn fragmentation only in terms of material. Players count pawns, see that they have the same number as the opponent, and conclude that the structure is roughly equal. But material count does not capture defensive workload. 3 pawn islands against 2 can mean that several of your pieces are committed to purely reactive roles, while the opponent's pieces remain free to generate threats. The asymmetry in piece activity is the real cost, and it is not visible in the pawn count alone. When a position has multiple pawn weaknesses of this kind, the defensive burden multiplies quickly. That connects directly to the concept of pawn islands. A pawn island is a group of pawns separated from all other friendly pawns by at least one empty file. If your pawns sit on the A and B files, and then there is a gap, and then more pawns on the E file, that is 2 islands. Each island is an independent defensive unit. It cannot draw support from the other island through pawn contact. The pieces that are tied to defensive duties around separate islands are not passive by choice. They are passive by obligation. The problem with multiple islands is not just that you have more pawns to protect. The problem is what defending them costs in terms of piece freedom. When a rook has to stay near a weak, isolated pawn on one side of the board, it cannot operate actively on the other side. When a bishop must remain near a fragmented island to guard it, it is no longer contributing to the broader contest. And a player whose pieces are spread thin across multiple defensive tasks is a player who has very little left over for creating threats. A connected, compact pawn structure limits the number of entry points the opponent can target at once. A single unified pawn mass is easier to defend because the pawns support each other and the pieces can operate more freely. As the number of islands grows, the number of directions from which the opponent can apply pressure also grows. Going from 2 islands to 3 is not a small step. When that third island is a single isolated pawn, it must be defended entirely by pieces, and because it sits in a different sector of the board from the other islands, the opponent can apply pressure from a new direction simultaneously, forcing the defender to split attention. Accepting an extra island can be justified when the compensation is concrete. Open lines that favor your pieces, the bishop pair in an open position, or the elimination of the opponent's most dangerous attacking piece. The question to ask is whether the piece activity you gain is actually enough to offset the defensive obligations you are taking on. If the answer is unclear, the structure is probably not worth accepting. Pawn chains introduce a different kind of structural commitment, and understanding them requires thinking about the squares the chain creates, rather than just the pawns themselves. A pawn chain is a diagonal sequence of same-colored pawns, where each pawn protects the one in front of it. The rearmost pawn in the chain is the base. It supports the pawns above it, but is not itself protected by any pawn from behind. That asymmetry is the key structural fact about a pawn chain. The pawns higher up in the chain are relatively secure because they are backed by the pawn below them. The base is exposed. The chain also creates a fixed diagonal of weak squares on the side it does not protect. Because the pawns are all on one diagonal, the squares on the other diagonal are permanently unguarded by pawns. Those squares tend to become stable outposts for the opponent's pieces. Once the chain is in place, those squares are not going to be reclaimed by a pawn later. The structure has committed them. Attacking the base of the chain is the standard strategic response, a recognized technique that strong players pursue methodically rather than stumble upon. The reason is straightforward. If the base can be removed or forced to advance into danger, the pawn directly above it loses its pawn support. The chain can unravel, and the weak squares that were always there behind the chain become suddenly more accessible. Attackers typically prepare pawn advances from adjacent files to create tension against the base, then double rooks on the file to increase pressure once the base is exposed. Defending a pawn chain means taking the base seriously from the moment the chain is formed. The base needs piece support. If it sits on a file that will become half open after exchanges, rooks and a queen can target it from a distance. The base should not be placed on a square that is easy for the opponent to reach, and it should not be left without adequate piece coverage while the opponent methodically prepares to attack it. The amateur tendency is to build a chain by pushing pawns forward without thinking about where the base will end up. Advancing the head of the chain without securing the base leads to overextension. The chain looks aggressive, but the foundation is soft. And because the chain is a structural commitment that is difficult to reverse, the vulnerability at the base tends to persist for the rest of the game. This is the deeper point about pawn structure as a whole. The decisions made early, which pawns to advance, which captures to accept, which formations to allow, create obligations that do not expire. A weakness accepted on move 8 is still a weakness on move 30. The structure is not a snapshot of the current moment. It is a record of every structural decision made so far, and the opponent reads that record with the same attention you should. Chapter 4: Piece Placement and the Principle of Active Defense. The pieces sitting on top of your pawn structure are the ones doing the actual work, and a piece doing the wrong kind of work is one of the most common reasons a structurally sound position still falls apart. Pawn structure gives you the skeleton of a defense. It tells you where the weaknesses are, which squares are permanently soft, and which files the opponent is likely to press. But structure alone does not defend anything. The distinction worth understanding here is between a passive piece and an active piece in a defensive role. Both are defending. That is not the difference. The difference is whether the piece is doing anything else at the same time. A passive defensive piece sits near a weakness, prevents immediate material loss, and does nothing else. It controls no squares the opponent cares about. It generates no counter pressure. It cannot punish overextension. From their point of view, that piece simply does not exist as a threat. And because it is not a threat, they can pile on additional attackers without any risk. They can double rooks on an open file, reposition a knight toward the weak square, bring up a queen, and at no point does the defender's passive piece make any of that more expensive. It just sits there absorbing pressure, while the opponent adds more. This is the mechanism behind gradual defensive erosion. It is rarely one blunder that collapses a position. It is the slow accumulation of pieces that each do only one job. Every piece that retreats to a purely defensive square removes one more voice from the defender's side of the conversation. The opponent is not taking risks because there is nothing to take risks against. An active defensive piece changes that dynamic. It defends the same weakness, but it also controls a key square, or threatens a counter move, or restricts the opponent's most dangerous piece. It forces them to account for it. That is the difference between a piece that is merely safe and a piece that is useful. Safety is not the standard. Usefulness in both directions is the standard. The evaluative habit that follows from this is simple. After placing any defensive piece, ask whether it defends and threatens, or only defends. If the answer is only defends, that is a signal to look harder for a square where the piece can do both. Finding that square is the concrete task of active defense, and it has a name. An anchor square is a specific location, typically pawn protected, positioned directly in the path of the opponent's intended advance or piece activity. A piece on an anchor square is difficult to dislodge because the opponent cannot use a pawn to challenge it without paying a structural cost, and cannot ignore it because it controls lines the attack depends on. The piece is not just sitting in the way. It is sitting in the way while also threatening something. The knight is the most natural occupant of an anchor square, and the reason is structural. Long-range pieces like bishops and rooks can be pressured from a distance. A bishop controlling a diagonal can be challenged by another bishop or by a pawn advance that cuts the diagonal. A rook on an open file can be traded off or blocked. A knight on a protected central square cannot be chased by any long-range piece, and if the pawns that could attack it have already advanced past it or been exchanged, it simply stays. Its short-range movement means it is immune to the usual methods of harassment, and its control of non-adjacent squares means it can simultaneously cover multiple entry points for the opponent's pieces. A knight well placed on an anchor square can do more defensive work than two pieces that are each doing only one job. The harder case is when no anchor square currently exists. The opponent's pawns are well placed. The structure is not yet open in the right places, and there is no obvious central square that meets the criteria. This is where the concept demands calculation, rather than pattern recognition. The defender has to ask whether a pawn move can create the anchor square, whether a piece trade can clear the path to it, or whether the pawn structure needs to be adjusted to make it available. This is not passive waiting. It is active construction of the conditions that make active defense possible. Identifying where the anchor square needs to be is the first question to ask once the opponent's plan becomes visible, even if reaching that square requires several preparatory moves. A common error at the club level is placing a knight on a defensive square that looks solid but is not actually an anchor. The square is protected. The knight is not immediately hanging, but the opponent can challenge it with a pawn advance in 2 or 3 moves. That knight will have to move, and when it does, the defensive structure it was holding together moves with it. The stability of the anchor square is not just about whether the piece is safe right now. It is about whether it will still be there when the opponent's attack arrives. The same active versus passive distinction applies to bishops, but the diagnosis is different. With a knight, the problem is usually placement. With a bishop, the problem is often structural, and moving the bishop does not fix it. A good bishop is one whose diagonals are open. Its own pawns sit on the opposite color, leaving the bishop squares clear to move through. A bad bishop is one whose diagonals are blocked by its own pawns, sitting on the same color squares. The bishop can still move, technically, but it has nowhere useful to go, because its own structure is in the way. The phrase sometimes used is big pawn, and that description is accurate. It occupies a square. It blocks nothing the opponent cares about, and it contributes nothing to the contest. The diagnostic tool is the pawn-color relationship. If the defender's pawns are fixed on the same color as the bishop is structurally imprisoned. It does not matter whether the bishop is on the back rank or in the center. It does not matter whether it is pointed at the opponent's king or tucked away behind the pawn chain. If the pawns are on the same color, the diagonals are closed, and the bishop is passive by structure rather than by placement. The practical consequence for defense is significant. A bad bishop cannot contest the opponent's key diagonals. It cannot support an anchor square on the opposite color. It cannot restrict the opponent's active pieces. They can simply ignore it, while building pressure on the squares the bishop cannot reach. And because the bishop is passive, the defender has one fewer piece contributing to the defense, which means the remaining pieces have to cover more ground. The instinct when a bishop is badly placed is to move it. Find a slightly better diagonal, tuck it somewhere it is not immediately in the way. But if the pawns are still on the same color, the structural problem is unchanged. The square changed. The diagnosis did not. The less obvious corrective is to look at the pawns around the bishop rather than the bishop itself. A pawn advance that breaks the chain can open a diagonal. A pawn exchange that removes a same-color pawn can free the bishop to reach squares it previously could not. These moves are often harder to see because the benefit is not immediate. A diagonal opens, but the bishop still needs a move or two to reach a useful square. The payoff is delayed, which makes the pawn move feel slow. It is not slow. It is the correct fix for the correct problem. The other option is to trade the bad bishop away. If the opponent has an active piece that is doing real work, and the defender can exchange the bad bishop for that piece, the trade often improves the defensive structure more than any repositioning would. The defender loses a piece that was contributing nothing, and removes a piece that was contributing a great deal. That is a net gain even though it looks like a material exchange. The specific position always has to be evaluated carefully, because not every trade of a bad bishop is correct, but the logic behind it is sound. A piece that is permanently passive is often worth less than the material it represents. The underlying principle connecting passive pieces, anchor squares, and bad bishops is the same one. Every piece in a defensive position should be earning its square, not just occupying it. not just preventing immediate loss. Earning it by controlling something your opponent needs, contesting something they want, or threatening something they have to account for. A piece that only defends is a piece that can be ignored, and a position full of pieces that can be ignored is a position that is already losing. Chapter 5. Coordination between defensive pieces. Imagine a position where your pieces are active, yet your defense crumbles. The issue isn't the activity of individual pieces, but their coordination. The real challenge is ensuring that your pieces form a coherent system, covering the right squares and leaving no gaps for your opponent to exploit. This system is a defensive network. Each piece in the network is responsible for a defined set of squares. Where those zones of responsibility overlap, the defense is redundant and hard to break. Where they fail to overlap, there is a gap. And gaps are precisely where the opponent's attack finds its entry point. The practical starting point for building this network is a counting habit. For any contested square near your king, you list every piece that can capture or defend it in one move, including pawns, and you compare those two totals. A square is adequately defended when the number of defenders equals or exceeds the number of attackers, and when that balance can be maintained through exchanges without creating new weaknesses elsewhere. When the attackers outnumber the defenders, the square is vulnerable. That is where the opponent will push. This sounds straightforward, and the counting itself is not technically difficult. What makes it hard in practice is that players apply it imprecisely. The most common error is assuming a square is defended because a piece nominally points at it, without checking whether that piece is itself unprotected, or whether it is pinned and cannot legally recapture. A pinned defender does not count. A hanging piece that would be lost in the exchange does not count. The count only reflects pieces that can actually follow through. A related error is failing to include pawns in the count at all, which causes players to underestimate their own defensive resources, and sometimes to miss that a square is more secure than it looks. There is also a timing problem. Players often evaluate the count correctly at one moment, and then stop updating it. After each move, the balance of attackers and defenders on every critical square can shift. A piece that was covering a key square may have just moved away. A new piece may have just joined the attack. The count is not a static fact about the position. It is a condition that needs to be rechecked. Proximity is not coverage. A piece sitting near the king is not the same as a piece that controls the squares the king actually needs protected. The diagnostic question is not which pieces are nearby. It is which squares are genuinely covered, which are not, and which specific piece should be assigned to close each gap. That assignment is where coordination begins. Once you can identify gaps in coverage, the next structural problem to watch for is the overloaded defender. An overloaded piece is one that has been assigned responsibility for two or more critical squares simultaneously, and whose coverage of both is geometrically impossible if the opponent applies pressure to both at once. The distinction between a busy piece and an overloaded piece matters here. A busy piece may be participating in several tasks that do not conflict with each other. An overloaded piece faces mutually incompatible obligations. If it stays to defend one target, the other becomes undefended. That contradiction is what the opponent exploits. Overloading rarely happens in a single move. More often, the opponent constructs it across several moves, gradually placing pressure on two separate targets until the defender is forced to choose between them. A bishop defending both a mating square and a critical pawn is a common example. A queen covering both the back rank and a weak minor piece is another. The defender often senses that one piece is doing a lot of work, but does not analyze concretely whether the opponent has a sequence that forces a choice. Then the sequence arrives, and the position collapses in a way that feels sudden, but was structurally prepared well in advance. Recognizing overloading requires the same counting discipline used to identify coverage gaps, applied one step further. After counting attackers and defenders, ask whether any single defender in your count is also responsible for a different critical square. If it is, and if the opponent can threaten both simultaneously, that piece is overloaded. The repair is to bring in additional defenders to share the load, so that no single piece is solely responsible for multiple tasks that cannot coexist. One practical method is to redistribute coverage by maneuvering a different piece to take over one of the two duties, freeing the overloaded piece to focus on the more urgent threat. Another is to exchange off one of the attacking pieces that is targeting the overloaded square, reducing the pressure to a level the existing defender can manage alone. In some cases, pawn regrouping can transfer coverage of a square from a higher value piece to a pawn, which frees that piece entirely. The specific method depends on the position, but the goal is always the same. No single piece should be carrying two defensive obligations that the opponent can pull apart. The third coordination problem, and the one often neglected in practice, is rook placement. Rooks are the most powerful pieces in a defensive setup when they are placed on files the opponent needs to use. They are the least useful when they sit behind their own pawns on closed files, contributing nothing to the network, while the rest of the pieces are asked to cover more than they can manage. Rooks coordinate defensively in two primary ways. The first is by contesting a file the opponent is trying to penetrate. If the opponent is building pressure along an open file toward your king, placing your rook on that file forces a contest. The opponent cannot simply walk in. They have to fight for the file, and that fight costs them time and resources. The second method is doubling rooks on a key file to make penetration impossible. When both rooks occupy the same file, one controlling the entry point and the second providing backup, the opponent cannot simply exchange off the first rook and seize control. The second rook immediately reclaims the file. The decision of where to place rooks in a defensive middle game depends on one prior question: is the back rank safe? When there is a looming back rank mating threat, rooks belong on the first rank. That is not passivity. That is the correct assignment, given the most forcing threat in the position. But once back rank safety is secured, the rooks should move to open or semi-open files where they can actively contest the opponent's entry lines. Keeping them on the first rank after that threat is resolved means leaving them absent from the defense at the moment they are most needed elsewhere. A rook buried on a closed file is not merely inactive. It is effectively absent. The rest of the defensive network has to compensate. Other pieces get stretched across more squares than they can cover cleanly. Coverage gaps open up, and the conditions for overloading are already being created. The passivity of one rook becomes a structural problem for every other piece in the position. The practical habit to build is treating rook activation as an urgent defensive task, not a luxury. When a rook is sitting behind a locked pawn chain and contributing nothing, the question is not whether to activate it, but how quickly. Sometimes that means advancing a pawn to create a semi-open file. Sometimes it means moving a king or minor piece to connect the rooks so they can reach central files. Sometimes it means accepting a rook exchange on an open file, because trading off an attacking rook actually improves the defensive balance, even though the exchange feels like a concession. That last point is worth pausing on. Many players hesitate to trade rooks because it feels like giving something up. But when the opponent's rook is the piece driving the attack along a critical file, exchanging it removes the most dangerous piece from the board. The resulting position with fewer rooks is often far safer than the one with both rooks present, and one of them dominating an open line into your king. This chapter explores a sequence of nested problems. Coverage gaps are the entry points for attack. Overloaded defenders are the mechanism by which those gaps appear, even in positions that look defended. And passive rooks are a structural issue that can lead to the rest of the network being overburdened. Addressing rook placement can alleviate pressure on other pieces, ensuring a more resilient defense. Chapter 6. Prophylaxis. Stopping threats before they exist. Prophylaxis. Stopping threats before they exist. Every move the opponent makes carries two pieces of information. What just happened? A piece moved. A square was vacated. A pawn was pushed. And what is being prepared? Most intermediate players read the first layer reliably. They see the move, they assess the immediate consequences, and they respond. The second layer is where prophylactic thinking lives, and it is the layer that separates the defender, who is always one step behind, from the one who is never surprised. The key word in prophylaxis is before. A move that stops a threat already on the board is a defensive response. A move that prevents a threat from ever reaching the board is prophylaxis, and the gap between those two is where the concept earns its value. That gap between the two is not subtle once you see it, but it requires a genuine shift in how you frame the question after each opponent move. Instead of asking only what just happened, you also ask what is being set up. This does not mean abandoning your own agenda. A well-chosen prophylactic move often advances your own position at the same time it closes off the opponent's plan. The prophylactic filter is not a detour from your thinking process. It is a crucial part of candidate move evaluation. Does this move also deny the opponent what they are building toward? When a candidate move answers yes to that question, while also improving your own position, it is frequently the strongest move available. One distinction worth holding clearly is the difference between a waiting move and a prophylactic move. A waiting move maintains the status quo and passes the decision back to the opponent without reducing their options. A prophylactic move actively restricts or eliminates the opponent's intended plan. Both can look quiet on the surface, but they are doing fundamentally different things. A waiting move is neutral. A prophylactic move is precise. A successful prophylactic move forces the opponent to spend extra moves finding a new plan or rerouting pieces, effectively taking a tempo away from their operation without making a direct threat of your own. The reason many intermediate players resist prophylactic thinking is partly psychological. Preventive moves can feel passive or overly cautious, especially when a player believes they have the initiative. But the objectively strongest move in a position is sometimes the one that stops the opponent's most dangerous idea, rather than the one that pushes your own plan forward one more step. Recognizing that is not timidity. It is accuracy. Once the core habit is in place, the next layer is learning to read not just the opponent's next move, but their next several moves as a connected plan. This is where plan identification becomes the central skill. A plan has a destination. The opponent is not just moving pieces randomly. They are steering the position toward a configuration where they have a structural advantage, a strong outpost, an open file, a concentrated attack. Identifying that destination is more useful than tracking individual moves because it tells you which step in the sequence is the most necessary one. Block that step, and the whole sequence becomes impossible, or significantly more costly to execute. The practical question to hold in mind is this: what does the opponent need to happen over the next 3 to 5 moves, and which single move of mine makes that sequence impossible? Working backward from the opponent's ideal position is a reliable method. Define what their dream configuration looks like. Then enumerate the preparatory moves they need to reach it. Then find the move that removes one of those necessary steps permanently. Instructional materials often describe this as identifying the key intermediate move in the opponent's plan, the specific pawn advance, piece exchange, or rerouting that makes everything else possible. That intermediate move is the target for prophylaxis. Stopping it at the root is more efficient than scrambling to answer each subsequent move as it arrives, because by the time the plan is fully developed, the individual moves within it are often forcing, and the defender has no good options left. Plan identification improves with pattern recognition. The more positions you have seen, the more quickly you recognize familiar strategic themes: a minority attack building on the queenside, a bishop being rerouted to a long diagonal, rooks being doubled on a half-open file aimed at a pawn. These are not random arrangements. They are standard plans with standard preparatory sequences, and recognizing the pattern early gives you time to prevent the key step before it happens. A common error at the intermediate level is treating the word threat as synonymous with immediate material loss. Tactical threats, forks, pins, checks, are visible and urgent, and players learn to respond to them reliably. But a strategic plan building slowly toward a dominant position is also a threat, just one that operates over more moves. Allowing a knight to be rerouted to a strong outpost without interference, or letting the opponent double rooks on a file without contesting it, are both failures of plan identification. The position does not feel urgent in the moment, but the evaluation is shifting steadily against you. The third layer of prophylactic thinking involves piece exchanges, and this is where many players have the clearest blind spot. Most players evaluate trades in terms of material balance. Am I giving up something of equal value? Am I winning material? Am I losing it? A prophylactic exchange is evaluated differently. The question is not what the pieces are worth right now, but what the opponent's piece will be worth once it reaches its intended square or roll. Removing a dangerous piece before it becomes dangerous is sometimes the most accurate move in the position, even if the trade looks unfavorable by standard material logic. The conditions that justify a prophylactic exchange are specific. The opponent's piece must be central to their plan, not merely active in a general sense. After the trade, the opponent must be unable to easily replace the attacking role of the removed piece with another. And the trading side must not create new weaknesses or lose coordination by making the exchange. When all three conditions are met, the trade is not a concession. It is the most precise available response to what the position is threatening to become. The criteria a defender should apply when evaluating a potential prophylactic exchange come down to 3 questions. How central is this piece to the opponent's plan? How difficult would it be to stop the plan without removing it? And what is lost by making the trade now versus allowing the piece to reach its ideal square? If the answers are very central, extremely difficult, and less than the cost of the plan succeeding, then the exchange is correct, regardless of how active your own piece currently looks. This is where the most common error appears. Players become attached to their own well-placed pieces and refuse to trade them for opponent pieces that currently look passive or less active. But the relevant comparison is not the current state of the pieces. It is the future state. A bishop that looks modest now, sitting behind a pawn chain, can become the most dangerous piece on the board once the chain breaks and the diagonal opens. Trading your active piece for that bishop before the chain breaks removes the threat entirely. Waiting until the chain breaks and the bishop activates means you are now responding to a threat rather than preventing one. Some coaching texts describe this error as misinterpreting a prophylactic exchange as helping the opponent simplify. The logic runs backward. The exchange does not simplify toward the opponent's advantage. It removes the specific piece that makes their plan viable. After the trade, the plan loses its engine, and what remains is a position where the opponent must find a new idea from scratch, often at a significant cost in tempo and piece coordination. Prophylactic thinking is a discipline applied at different scales. At the move level, it involves anticipating the opponent's preparations. At the plan level, it requires identifying and blocking the critical step in their sequence. At the exchange level, it means evaluating pieces by their future role in the opponent's plan rather than their current activity. Each layer builds on the same underlying question: how can you deny the opponent's needs before they become unavoidable? Chapter 7. Recognizing tactical threats against your position. What is the opponent threatening right now? And specifically, what tactical blow might they be setting up? These two dimensions of awareness do not take turns. They operate at the same time, and a defender who handles one without the other will eventually be caught by the gap. This is the tactical layer of defensive thinking, and the entry point is a single habit. Before you evaluate any candidate move, before you ask what your position needs or where your pieces want to go, you ask one question first: what did the opponent's last move create? Not what did it look like, not where did the piece land, but what threat, if any, did that move introduce? This question has to come first, because the most common form of tactical failure in defense is not miscalculating a sequence. It is playing an unrelated move entirely, improving a piece or advancing a pawn, while the opponent's threat goes unaddressed and becomes decisive. The scan you are doing is not a search for every possible move the opponent could make. That would be paralyzing and unnecessary. It is a focused check on the most dangerous squares and the most active enemy pieces. You are asking whether the last move opened a line, created a new attack on one of your pieces, or repositioned something into a more threatening configuration. Most of the time the answer is that nothing immediate has changed. But the habit of asking keeps you from being surprised by the times when the answer is different. One thing worth slowing down on is the idea that a threat does not have to be executable right now to be dangerous. If the opponent is building toward a combination that will be decisive in 2 moves, that is a threat today. The fact that you have one move before it lands does not mean you can ignore it. It means you have exactly one move to address it. Treating a 2-move threat as a future problem rather than a present one is the thinking pattern that leads to positions where the defender is always one tempo short of holding. The question to ask is not just what can the opponent do this move, but what are they setting up that becomes unstoppable if you do not act now? Once you have answered that question and confirmed whether a threat exists, the next task is recognizing what kind of threat it is. Certain tactical patterns appear far more often than others when defensive positions break down, and each one has a set of prerequisites that must be in place before it can be executed. The defender's job is to notice those prerequisites forming, not to calculate the full combination after it has already been set up. A pin requires 3 pieces aligned along a rank, file, or diagonal: the attacking piece, the piece being pinned, and a piece sitting directly behind it that is either more valuable or one the defender cannot afford to lose. The pinned piece cannot move without exposing what is behind it. The warning sign for the defender is not the pin itself, but the setup that makes it possible. When an opponent's bishop or rook is aimed along a line that passes through one of your pieces toward your king or queen, that setup is the prerequisite. If you can break the line before the pin is executed, the tactic never happens. A skewer is the reverse geometry. The more valuable piece is in front, and when it is forced to move, a less valuable piece behind it is exposed. The prerequisite is the same kind of setup, a line piece aimed at a high-value target with something sitting behind it. The defender should be checking whether any of their pieces are arranged in a way that creates this vulnerability. A fork is a single piece attacking two of your pieces at once, forcing you to give up one of them. Knight forks receive particular attention in coaching because the knight's movement pattern is non-linear, and it is the only piece that can jump over other pieces, which makes these combinations less visually obvious than those involving line pieces. The prerequisite for a fork is that two of your pieces are positioned within the forking range of an opponent's piece, with no way to move both out of danger simultaneously. The defensive warning sign is seeing your pieces land on squares that a knight or queen could reach from a single square, especially when the opponent has a piece that could get there in one or two moves. A discovered attack occurs when a piece moves away and the piece behind it suddenly has an open line of attack. The front piece often creates its own threat as it moves, which means you are being hit on two fronts at once. The prerequisite is that the opponent has two pieces on the same line, with the front one capable of moving. The defender should be watching for this configuration forming, particularly when the opponent is maneuvering a piece that seems to have no obvious destination, because the destination may be less important than what the move uncovers. What connects all four of these patterns is that none of them appear instantly. Each one requires a specific piece configuration that takes multiple moves to construct. That construction process is visible if you are watching for it. The opponent rarely conceals the fact that they are aligning pieces along a diagonal or maneuvering a knight toward a central square. The prerequisites are there on the board before the tactic fires. The defender who is scanning for warning signs has time to disrupt the setup before it becomes a problem. The defender who only reacts after the combination is executed has already lost the tempo that mattered. The back rank is worth treating as its own category because it sits at the intersection of structure and tactics in a way that makes it particularly easy to overlook. The back rank weakness arises when the king is confined on its home rank by its own pawns, with no escape square available, and the opponent has a rook or queen positioned on an open file that reaches that rank. The immediate threat is a rook or queen sliding to the back rank and delivering checkmate, with the king unable to step off because every adjacent square is blocked by its own pieces. What makes this vulnerability different from the tactical patterns discussed above is that it is a structural condition first and a tactical threat second. The king can sit behind an intact pawn shield for many moves with no apparent danger, and then a single rook trade or file opening suddenly makes the back rank mate executable in one move. Because the condition was present long before the threat became concrete, it tends to fall outside the defender's immediate attention. The focus is on the local exchange, or the piece maneuvering happening in the center, and the back rank sits quietly in the background until it is too late. The two most direct remedies are well established. Creating an escape square, typically by advancing the rook pawn one square, gives the king a flight square and removes the structural condition entirely. The cost is a tempo, and occasionally a small pawn weakness, but when the back rank is genuinely at risk, that trade is very often worth making. The second option is exchanging the opponent's rooks or queens that are controlling the open file leading to your back rank. Remove the piece that would deliver the mate, and the threat dissolves even if the structural condition remains. The habit to build is checking back rank safety as a routine part of the defensive scan, not as a separate task, but as one of the fixed questions you ask alongside the tactical pattern check. Is my king confined? Is there an open file? Does the opponent have a heavy piece that could use it? If all three answers are yes at the same time, that is a condition requiring immediate attention, regardless of what else is happening on the board. The tactical scan and the pattern recognition for pins, skewers, forks, and discovered attacks are components of a single question you ask before every move. What is the opponent threatening, and what form is that threat taking? As we move into Chapter 8, we will explore how these tactical insights integrate with defensive calculation, ensuring that your responses are both timely and precise. Chapter 8: Calculating defensive moves under pressure. You now have a reliable process for identifying what the opponent is threatening. You can spot the pin, recognize the fork setup, notice the back rank pressure before it becomes critical. That foundation matters. But knowing what threatens you is a different skill from calculating how to answer it accurately. Defensive calculation is not just attacking calculation applied to a harder problem. It operates under a fundamentally different set of constraints, and those constraints change what the thinking process needs to look like. When you are the one attacking, the position is usually open in front of you. You have multiple candidate moves. You can explore one line, decide it is not quite right, and shift to another without much cost. The freedom of the attacking position is real. You get to choose which problem you want to pose. Defense does not work that way. When a serious threat is on the board, some of your moves are already ruled out. A forced defensive situation narrows the legal landscape in a way that feels constraining. And here is where the first and most important error enters. Players feel that constraint and interpret it as permission to think less. Fewer options seems to imply a shorter calculation process. It does not. In writing on chess psychology, a well-documented pattern describes players under attack, searching primarily for lines that confirm they are losing, rather than lines that hold. That is confirmation bias operating inside the calculation process. The position feels bad, so the mind looks for evidence that it is bad, and stops looking for the move that might save it. A related observation appears frequently in instructional chess literature. Players who believe their position is worse tend to overestimate the opponent's threats and underestimate their own defensive resources. Both of these tendencies narrow the candidate move search at precisely the moment when that search needs to be most thorough. The discipline of defensive calculation is the discipline of generating multiple candidate defensive moves, even when the position feels like it only has one. That habit, held firmly against the instinct to react quickly, is what separates accurate defenders from reactive ones. Constriction in the position is not permission to narrow the thinking process. It is a signal to slow down and apply that process more carefully. Once you have committed to generating candidates, rather than grabbing the first move that parries the threat, the next question is where to start. A structured hierarchy helps here, not as a rigid rule, but as a checklist that prevents tunnel vision. The three broad categories of defensive response, in a useful order of priority, are capturing the attacking piece, blocking or interposing against the threat, and moving the attacked piece to safety. Working through these in order does not mean you will always choose the first option. It means you will not skip a category because you are already committed to the third one before you looked at the first. Capturing the attacking piece is worth examining first because, when it works cleanly, it removes the threat entirely and often improves your material situation or piece activity in the process. The conditions matter. Capturing is the right instinct, when it does not worsen your king's safety, does not walk into a known tactical motif, and either wins material or maintains the balance. When those conditions are not met, you move to the next category. Blocking and interposing are often treated as the same idea, but they are worth distinguishing. Blocking in the loose sense means placing a piece between the attacker and the target. Interposing specifically means introducing a piece that was not already near the threat, which creates a new dynamic in the position. That new dynamic is not always favorable. A piece interposed on a file in front of the king can become pinned immediately, and a pinned piece is not a real defender. As established earlier, a pinned defender does not count in the attacker-defender calculation because it cannot legally recapture. So a block that looks like it solves the problem may actually create a new overloaded or pinned piece that the opponent can exploit on the very next move. This is why interposing deserves careful examination rather than reflexive use. Moving the attacked piece is the third category, and it comes with its own set of restrictions. If the piece is pinned to the king or queen, moving it is not legal or creates an immediate decisive loss on the pinned unit. If the piece is an overloaded defender, moving it abandons whatever else it was protecting. In multi-threat positions, where the opponent is attacking more than one target simultaneously, the hierarchy shifts. The priority becomes addressing the most forcing threat first, typically the one involving checkmate or queen loss, and ideally finding a single move that neutralizes more than one threat at once. A move that saves a rook but leaves the king in a mating net is not a defense. It is a delay. A useful principle about multi-threat positions holds that strong defenders often choose moves that improve overall coordination and reduce the number of separate threats rather than simply saving the most valuable single piece. That framing is worth holding on to. The goal of the defensive response is not to save the most expensive piece. The goal is to resolve the most dangerous situation. Working through this hierarchy takes time. That is the point. The player who grabs the first move that looks like it parries the threat, without checking the other categories, is making a candidate move selection error. Coaches including GM Jacob Agard classify this explicitly as a pressure-induced mistake, not a skill gap. After you have identified a candidate defensive move that appears to address the threat, there is one more step before you commit to it. This step is where most defensive blunders actually originate. The verification step asks a specific question. Does this move fully resolve the threat, or does it merely delay it by one move? Those are not the same thing. A defense that stops the immediate attack, but leaves the opponent with a simple follow-up, a shift of pieces to a new file, a discovered check, a second sacrifice, is not a defense. It is a postponement. The pattern is well documented. A player sees a mating threat, finds a move that blocks it, and stops calculating. The opponent plays a quiet move that relocates the attack to a different line, and the position collapses anyway. The defender stopped one move too early and assumed the problem was solved because the immediate threat was gone. It was not gone. It was redirected. Verification means playing the opponent's best response to your candidate move inside your head before you touch the piece. Not their most obvious response. Their most forcing response. That means checks, captures, and threats available to them after your move, and whether each of those can be answered without material loss or a new mating attack. If your candidate defense survives that check, it is a real defense. If it does not, it is a candidate you need to discard. Discarding is important to name explicitly. When analysis shows that a candidate defensive move leads to a forced loss, regardless of your follow-up choices, the correct response is to go back to the hierarchy, and find a different candidate. Not to play the move anyway, and hope the opponent misses the refutation. Not to accept the loss as inevitable. Go back, restart the search, and apply the same verification process to the next candidate. A common mistake during move selection is failing to consider the opponent's most forcing replies to the chosen defensive move, focusing instead on the defender's own intended next move. That is the error verification is designed to prevent. The question is not what you plan to do next. The question is what the opponent can do next, and whether your defense survives it. Most defensive blunders are not failures of calculation depth. They are failures of this final check. The player calculated far enough to find a legal move that addressed the surface of the threat, and then stopped. The verification habit, applied consistently and treated as non-negotiable, is what closes that gap. The internal process this chapter builds toward involves generating multiple candidate defensive moves, working through a structured hierarchy, and verifying each candidate against the opponent's best follow-up. Applying this sequence with patience, especially when the instinct to react quickly is strongest, is what makes defensive calculation reliable. Chapter 9. The Role of Exchanges in Simplifying Defense. In many defensive positions, the central challenge is managing exchanges. Not an exchange that restores material balance, and not a sacrifice designed to counterattack, but a deliberate trade whose purpose is to remove dangerous pieces from the board and reduce the pressure bearing down on your position. That distinction matters, because the reasoning behind an exchange shapes which trade you look for and how you evaluate whether it worked. At the club level, exchanges under pressure are frequently misread. The most common error is treating a trade as a concession, something you do when you have no better option, rather than as a tool with a specific purpose. The second common error runs in the opposite direction, trading pieces simply to reduce the total count on the board, without asking whether the resulting position is actually safer. Both errors come from measuring the wrong thing. The question is not whether the exchange is materially even. The question is whether it reduces danger. When the opponent is attacking, their pieces are not equally threatening. Some are doing most of the work. They are sitting on open lines, pointing at your king, coordinating with 2 or 3 other pieces to create threats you cannot address all at once. Other pieces are contributing less, maybe sitting back, maybe restricted by your own pawn structure, maybe simply not yet involved. The piece doing the most work is the one you want off the board. This is the core principle of exchange-based defense. Trade the opponent's most active attacking piece for one of your less active defenders. The trade is almost always favorable for you, even if the pieces are nominally of equal value, because what you are exchanging is not material. You are exchanging their capacity to attack. Piece activity in this context is not abstract. It is observable. An active attacking piece has at least one of 3 features. It sits on an open line, meaning a file or diagonal with no pawns blocking its reach. It is positioned close to your king, meaning it can threaten checks or captures without needing to reposition. Or it is coordinating with other attacking pieces, meaning its threats are connected to threats elsewhere on the board, and your defenders cannot address both simultaneously. A piece with all 3 of those features is the most dangerous piece on the board. A piece with none of them is not contributing much to the attack, and trading it away accomplishes little. The defender's goal in an exchange is not to equalize. It is to remove the piece that is making the position difficult to hold. If the opponent's queen is doing most of the attacking work, and you can force a queen trade, the resulting position with equal material but no queens is often easier to defend, even if your own queen was also a strong piece. What you gave up in attacking potential is less relevant than what you removed from the opponent's arsenal. One useful way to frame this is that a good defensive exchange takes the steam out of an attack. The threat structure that was building, the coordination between pieces, the pressure on specific squares, all of it depends on those pieces being present and active. Remove the key piece, and the rest of the attack often loses its coherence. The remaining attackers still exist, but they are working without the piece that was connecting their threats. Not every exchange reduces danger. Some trades make the position worse for the defender, and recognizing when that is true is just as important as recognizing when a trade helps. The first backfire scenario is the more common one at the club level and the less obvious. It happens when the defender trades away a piece that was performing a critical defensive duty. Every piece in a sound defensive position is covering something. Some pieces are covering squares, some are blocking files, some are preventing the opponent's pieces from reaching key locations. When you trade one of those pieces away, even in exchange for an active attacking piece, you may be opening a line or uncovering a square that was previously protected. The result is that you removed one threat and created a different, potentially worse one. This is the concept of a defensive anchor piece. A defensive anchor is a piece whose presence is holding something together structurally. It might be a knight sitting on a square that prevents the opponent's bishop from reaching your king. It might be a rook covering the only open file near your position. It might be a bishop whose diagonal is the only thing keeping the opponent's queen from infiltrating. When that piece is traded away, the thing it was holding together collapses. And unlike a material imbalance, which can sometimes be compensated for, structural collapse of this kind is often irreversible. The open line stays open. The square stays weak. The opponent's pieces flow into the gap. The key question before any defensive trade is not just whether the opponent's piece is dangerous. It is whether your piece is doing something that cannot be replaced. If the answer is yes, the trade may relieve one form of pressure while creating a worse one. Stabilizing the position before simplifying is the right order of operations, because an exchange made in the middle of a crisis, before the immediate threats are addressed, often removes the wrong piece at the wrong moment. The second backfire scenario is structural. Some positions are materially equal, but lost in the endgame because of permanent weaknesses, space disadvantages, or the opponent's superior piece activity. Simplifying into an equal piece count does not help if the resulting position is still losing. A simplified position can still be dangerous if the opponent retains the initiative and your structural problems remain. The test is not whether the position looks calmer after the trade. The test is whether the resulting position is genuinely defensible. The third dimension of exchange-based defense is one that many players overlook entirely. Exchanges do not have to be reactive. The defender can offer a trade proactively, before being forced into one, and use that offer to disrupt the attacker's coordination, rather than simply absorbing pressure. This is a meaningful shift in how to think about defense. Reactive exchanges happen when the opponent creates a threat, and you respond by trading a piece to resolve it. Proactive exchange offers happen when you identify which piece the opponent is relying on to build their attack, and you offer to trade it away before the attack is fully assembled. The difference in timing is significant. An attacker whose pieces are not yet fully coordinated has not yet reached the position of maximum danger. Offering a trade at that point forces them to either accept and lose the piece they were building around, or decline and reorganize their plan. Either outcome disrupts the momentum of the attack. Timing is the critical variable here. Offering a trade before the opponent's attack reaches full coordination is typically far more effective than offering it after. Once the attacker has all their pieces pointing at the right squares, they have more flexibility to decline your offer and continue pressing. But if you offer the trade while they are still maneuvering, while the key piece has not yet reached its optimal square, accepting the offer is more tempting and declining it is more costly. This kind of proactive exchange offer is not a sign of weakness. It is an initiative. The defender who makes it is not conceding that the position is lost and hoping for simplification. The defender is choosing the moment and the terms of the trade, which means they are shaping what the position becomes, rather than reacting to what the opponent builds. The attacker who accepts loses the piece their plan depended on. The attacker who declines has to re-rote, and that re-roting costs tempo and coordination. In either case, the defender has transferred some control over the game's direction back to their own side. Ultimately, the defender's ability to manage exchanges determines the flow of the game. By choosing the right moments to trade, you can dismantle the opponent's attack, stabilize your position, and regain control over the board. Chapter 10: Defending against pawn storms and structural attacks. A pawn storm involves two or more pawns moving forward together in successive moves aimed at a specific target. That target is usually the pawn shelter in front of the castled king, but it can also be a key structural point, like a fixed square or a weak pawn that, once removed, collapses the surrounding formation. The first thing to do when you see pawns advancing toward your position is to identify what those pawns are actually aimed at. That question comes before any defensive decision, because the right response depends entirely on the answer. This matters because not every pawn advance on the flank is a storm. A single pawn pushed forward to claim space or restrict a piece is doing a local job. It is not coordinated with anything behind it, and it does not have the momentum to open lines or create lasting structural damage on its own. Treating that kind of move as a full emergency and reacting with weakening defensive pawn moves is one of the most common ways defenders create problems for themselves. The pawn advance that prompted the reaction was not dangerous. The reaction was. Once you have confirmed that a genuine storm is underway, the next diagnostic step is to determine what kind of storm it is. There are two distinct types, and they demand different answers. The first type is line opening. The advancing pawns are aimed at your pawn cover with the intention of trading or sacrificing into it, removing the shelter and exposing the king to the pieces behind the advance. The second type is structurally damaging. Here the pawns do not necessarily trade. They advance to provoke defensive pawn moves, create holes, or fix weaknesses that enemy pieces can occupy later. In a line-opening advance, the danger is immediate and concrete, open files and diagonals leading to the king. In a structurally damaging advance, the danger is slower, but equally real. The position gradually deteriorates as the pawn structure becomes inflexible and the opponent's pieces find permanent homes. A useful diagnostic marker is the transition from preparatory to immediately dangerous, which occurs when a specific pawn break becomes tactically justified and cannot be safely stopped. A useful habit is to count the attackers and defenders near the threatened area and note when the attacking side has achieved a local numerical advantage. When that advantage tips, the pressure is no longer theoretical. It is arriving. Recognizing that moment early gives you time to choose a response deliberately, rather than scrambling to react. The two principal responses to a pawn storm are closing the position and generating counterplay on the opposite wing. Each of these is a deliberate strategic choice, not a fallback. The evaluation of which one fits a given position is what the rest of this chapter addresses. Closing the position means using a pawn advance to block the incoming pressure, locking the pawn chains, and reducing the attacker's ability to open files. A closed position, in this context, means pawn contact has been established in a way that prevents either side from easily advancing further without a specific pawn break. The advance loses its momentum because the pawns it was driving forward have nowhere to go. This is not a passive or fearful choice. It is a transformation of the game's character, initiated by the defender. The attacker wanted an open position with lines aimed at the king. The defender refuses that and creates a different kind of game. But the trade-off is real and must be evaluated honestly. Closing the position restricts both sides. Rooks and bishops on the side where the pawns are locked lose scope. Knights become more valuable because they can maneuver over blocked lines. If the defender's position features bishops as key pieces, locking the structure may imprison them, which is a long-term cost that outlasts the immediate defensive benefit. The assessment before committing to closure involves several questions. Which of your pieces benefit from a closed structure, and which are harmed? Does the attacker have a pawn break that can reopen the position later, attacking the base of the chain you just created? Have you completed enough development to maneuver comfortably behind the pawn barrier? If the answers suggest your pieces will become passive, and the attacker retains the ability to reopen the position at will, then closure may create a different kind of problem, rather than solving the original one. A closed position favors the defender most clearly, when the attacker's pawns are overextended and cannot be supported by pieces, and when the defender's king is genuinely safe behind the locked chain. The documented mistake is closing the position too late, after the attacker has already achieved multiple pawn breaks. At that point, the locking attempt fails, and may even create new weaknesses. The decision to close has to be made while the advance is still building, not after it has already opened lines. The second principal response is counterplay on the opposite wing. The logic here is that a pawn storm requires the attacker to commit resources to one side of the board. If the defender can generate a genuine threat on the other wing, the attacker is forced to divert some of those resources, which slows the advance and may give the defender time to consolidate. The principle that flank operations are best countered by activity in the center or on the opposite flank is one of the foundational ideas in classical positional theory, associated most closely with the hypermodern school and elaborated extensively in the literature on pawn chain dynamics. The word genuine matters. Counterplay in this context means creating concrete threats, passed pawns, open files for rooks, pressure on the attacker's own king or pawn structure. It is not a speculative lunge designed to distract. The opponent will not divert resources unless the threat is real enough to demand attention. Queenside pawn breaks like advancing the B pawn, C pawn, or A pawn to open files and activate rooks are the most common tools for this kind of counterplay against a kingside advance. Timing is the most critical element of opposite wing counterplay, and it is where most failures occur. The counterplay has to be initiated before the pressure reaches critical mass. Once the attacking pawns have opened key files and diagonals around the king, the defender rarely has the tempo to generate threats elsewhere that matter. The attack is already local and decisive. The counterplay arrives too late to redirect anything. This means the defender must begin preparing counterplay while the advance is still in its preparatory phase, which requires reading the advance's trajectory early, rather than waiting for the danger to become obvious. There are two documented traps. The first is ignoring counterplay entirely and surrendering the initiative, responding to each pawn advance reactively, without ever creating a competing agenda. This allows the attacker to advance at their own pace, without any diversion of resources. The second trap is overcommitting to counterplay and leaving the king inadequately defended. If the counterplay requires the defender to strip away pieces that were covering the king, the advance may break through before the opposing threats become relevant. The attacker can sometimes ignore queenside counterplay entirely when their own attack features direct mating threats that arrive in fewer moves than the defender's threats. The balance the defender has to hold is precise. The advance's progress must be monitored continuously while the counterplay is being developed. If the advance accelerates, the counterplay may need to be paused to address a concrete threat. If the counterplay generates a threat the attacker cannot ignore, the advance may slow on its own. These two agendas run simultaneously, and neither can be abandoned for the other without cost. Before choosing a response, the defender needs to know what the advance is targeting, what type of advance it is, which pieces benefit from each structural outcome, and whether the timing of each option is still viable. The defender who has identified the advance correctly and assessed the position honestly arrives at one of these responses through reasoning rather than instinct. That reasoning is what makes the choice reliable across different positions, rather than lucky in a specific one. Chapter 11. Counterplay as a defensive weapon. The previous chapter ended with a specific tool, generating threats on the opposite wing to slow a pawn storm. That tool works because it forces the attacker to divide attention. But the principle behind it reaches further than pawn storms. Counterplay is not just a tool for handling pawn storms. It is a general defensive philosophy, available across all kinds of middle game positions, and understanding it fully means rethinking what defense is actually supposed to accomplish. The shift is from containment to initiative. From surviving the opponent's plan to making them survive yours. The first concept that makes this possible is the counter-threaten. A purely defensive move answers the opponent's threat and does nothing else. The opponent attacks, you defend, and then they attack again. As established earlier, the initiative stays with them. A counter-threaten does something different. It meets the defensive need while simultaneously placing a new demand on the opponent. They now have to choose between continuing their attack and addressing the threat you just created. That division of attention is the whole point. For a counter-threaten to actually work, it has to meet a specific condition. The new threat you create must be serious enough that the opponent cannot safely ignore it and simply continue their original plan. A quiet positional improvement does not suffice. A move that attacks a well-defended piece, or creates only a distant, slow idea, is inadequate as well. The threat has to be forcing. Typically that means a check, a capture, or an attack on a genuinely vulnerable target, such as the opponent's king, queen, or a critical weakness in their structure. The test is concrete. If the opponent ignores your move and continues their attack, does their attack succeed? If yes, the counter-threaten was not strong enough. If no, you have genuinely shifted the burden. One useful way to evaluate this is to ask whether the opponent's best reply is now forced to parry your new threat, rather than improve their attacking pieces. When that is true, you have effectively stolen a tempo from their attack. They were building towards something, and now they have to stop and deal with you. That is a meaningful change in the flow of the game. The distinction between a move that merely defends and a move that defends while threatening is the conceptual core of dynamic defense. It is also the distinction that separates reactive thinking from something more active. Reactive defense answers the question the opponent is asking. A counter-threaten asks a question back. The common error here is settling for the first legal move that addresses the threat. That is understandable under pressure, but it is a habit worth breaking. Before accepting a passive reply, the discipline is to search for a move that does both jobs at once. The counter-threaten is not always available, but it should be looked for before accepting a passive reply. Accepting a purely passive defense without checking first is giving up something that might have been there. One important caution: a counter-threaten that leaves your own king exposed, or creates new weaknesses around it, is not a defensive weapon. It is a gamble. The move has to genuinely meet the defensive need, not just appear to. A common amateur error is launching an active-looking counter-threaten while leaving pieces hanging or allowing a simple fork or pin against the king. Attacking the opponent's queen or rook feels productive, but if there is a mating threat on the board that your move does not address, the counter-threaten has failed regardless of how aggressive it looks. Knowing that counterplay is available is one thing. Knowing when to initiate it is another problem entirely. Acting too early can accelerate the opponent's attack rather than slow it. If your king is still in a mating net and you push for activity on the other side of the board, you may simply give the opponent additional tempi as they attack your newly advanced pieces. Acting too late means the attack has already succeeded. The timing problem is real, and it requires reading the opponent's position as carefully as your own. The most reliable signal that the moment to transition has arrived is when the attacker has committed resources to a specific plan and cannot easily redirect them. This is the key idea. An attacker who has pushed pawns past the point of no return, concentrated pieces heavily on one wing, or neglected development in their own camp, has made an irreversible commitment. Their position has a direction, and it is no longer flexible. That inflexibility is the opening for counterplay. What you are looking for concretely is overextension, many pieces committed to one wing, with no reserves available to defend the home position, pawns advanced into the opponent's territory, creating permanent holes behind them, or a king still in the center, while the attack is being pushed on the flank. These are structural signals that the attacker's resources are stretched, and that counterplay on the neglected side can force a genuine crisis. But the transition moment also has internal conditions that have to be met on your own side of the board. Immediate mating threats must be neutralized first. Your pieces need to be reasonably coordinated, rather than hanging or tactically overloaded. There must be concrete targets in the opponent's camp that can be reached with tempo, not just vague space or distant pawns. And at least one or two of your pieces must be free from strict defensive duties and capable of rapidly reaching the target area. The error to correct here is treating discomfort as the signal. When the position feels difficult, the instinct is to do something active. But discomfort alone tells you nothing about whether the opponent's attack has lost its forcing character, whether your king is genuinely safe, or whether you have the pieces available to support new operations. Those are the actual conditions that matter. The transition from defense to counterplay should be a reasoned decision, not a response to anxiety. Once counterplay is underway, the hardest discipline is maintaining defensive integrity at the same time. Defensive integrity means the king is safe, and no immediate tactical threats exist against your position. That condition has to remain true while you are generating threats elsewhere. This is genuinely difficult, because the two goals can pull against each other. Creating counterplay often involves piece movement, pawn advances, and opening lines, all of which can introduce new vulnerabilities if they are not carefully managed. The key standard is this: counterplay that exposes the king or creates new weaknesses that cannot be covered is not a defensive weapon. It is a structural trade that may or may not work out. That is a different category of decision entirely, and it should be recognized as such. rather than dressed up as dynamic defense. The warning signs are specific. Pawn moves that create new holes around the king. A back rank left unprotected while pieces move forward. Pieces becoming overloaded, defending multiple critical points, while also participating in the counterplay operation. These are indicators that the defensive structure has been compromised by the activity being generated. The counterplay is no longer working with the defense. It is working against it. A related error is continuing an attractive counterplay plan after the opponent has introduced a new, stronger threat that changes the priorities. The plan was sound when it was chosen, but the position has changed. The discipline is to re-evaluate, rather than commit to the original idea out of momentum. Sometimes the correct decision is to stop the counterplay entirely, return a pawn, exchange an attacking piece, or simply consolidate before trying again. That kind of flexibility is not weakness. It is accurate reading of what the position requires. When the defensive cost of counterplay is too high, the right move is to consolidate first. Stabilize the king. Eliminate the opponent's most dangerous piece through exchange or neutralization. Cover the loose squares. Then, from a position of genuine stability, look for activity again. The true art of counterplay lies in transforming pressure into opportunity, turning a defensive stance into an active challenge for the opponent to solve. Chapter 12. Defending in the Endgame. Principles that differ from the middle game. Everything covered so far has been built around a common thread. Defense and initiative are not opposites. A defender can generate pressure, disrupt timing, and force the opponent to solve problems, rather than simply absorbing whatever comes. That framework is real, and it holds. But it was built for the middle game, and the endgame is a different environment with different rules. Not a harder version of the same rules. Different ones. The instincts that served well with queens on the board can become liabilities once the position simplifies, and the adjustment required is not minor. It is a genuine reorientation of how you read a position and what you are trying to accomplish inside it. The most important thing to understand first is why the transfer does not happen automatically. A player who has learned to defend actively in the middle game has built a set of habits around piece coordination, counterplay timing, and the management of threats that are immediate and often tactical. Those habits are built for a board that is still crowded, where pieces can absorb pressure, where a single strong piece can hold multiple responsibilities, and where a threat that is not yet concrete can sometimes be safely deferred. The endgame strips most of that away. Fewer pieces means fewer resources to absorb anything. Threats that looked manageable with more material on the board become structurally permanent once the position simplifies. And the clock on every decision runs faster, not because the time control changes, but because there is less room to recover from a wrong move. Passivity is the first instinct that needs to go. In the middle game, a passive piece can sometimes be tolerated because other pieces are active enough to compensate, and because the opponent's attack may not yet have a concrete breakthrough. In the endgame, passivity is not a neutral condition. It is a slow structural failure. With fewer pieces on the board, every piece that is not contributing actively is a piece the opponent does not have to account for. And in an endgame, not being accounted for is not safety. It is irrelevance. An irrelevant piece in an endgame means the opponent is effectively playing with more resources than you are, even if the material count is technically equal. The pawn is where this becomes most concrete. In the middle game, a pawn weakness is a problem, but it is often a manageable one. Pieces can blockade it, cover it, or work around it while the game's main contest plays out elsewhere. In the endgame, every pawn carries permanent weight. A weak pawn in the endgame is not a liability you manage. It is a fixed obligation that ties a piece to a square indefinitely, draining the position of flexibility and removing options that do not come back. And because the board is quieter, the opponent has the time and the space to methodically target it. Trading pawns can sometimes relieve this kind of pressure. Reducing the number of weaknesses on the board reduces the number of fixed obligations, and fewer obligations means more freedom for the pieces that remain. But the decision to trade pawns has to be made with a clear understanding of what the resulting pawn structure looks like, because in the endgame, structural consequences do not get papered over by tactical complications. They simply sit there. The king is the second instinct that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Everything taught earlier about king's safety was built around the idea that the king is a vulnerable piece requiring shelter, and that exposing it is a defensive failure. That framework is correct for the middle game. In the endgame, it inverts. The king in an endgame is not a piece to protect. It is a piece to activate. A king that stays behind its pawn shelter while the endgame plays out around it is not safe. It is absent. And an absent king in an endgame is a defensive error in the same way that a passive rook is a defensive error in the middle game. It means a critical resource is not doing its job. Activating the king means walking it toward the center, toward contested pawns, toward the area of the board where the critical decisions are being made. This feels counterintuitive because the habit of keeping the king sheltered is deeply ingrained. But the reason that habit exists is that in the middle game, the opponent has enough pieces to exploit an exposed king immediately. In the endgame, those pieces are gone. The king's exposure is no longer a tactical vulnerability. It is a positional asset. A centralized king controls squares, supports passed pawns, blockades enemy pawns, and participates in the conversion of advantages that no other piece can reach in time. Failing to bring the king into the game is not caution. In most endgames, it is a concession. This connects to a broader shift in what defensive success actually looks like in the endgame. In the middle game, good defense often means surviving a crisis, neutralizing an attack, and returning to a position where the game is balanced and playable. There is a recovery arc built into middle game defense. The endgame rarely offers that arc. In the endgame, the goal of defense is more specific: eliminate losing chances, not generate winning ones. Not recover from a bad position. Eliminate the concrete mechanisms by which the opponent converts their advantage. This is a narrower goal, and it requires careful judgment. Every tempo matters, because there is no reserve of activity to draw on. Every pawn placement matters, because structural decisions are permanent. Every king move matters, because the king is one of the few remaining pieces, and its position shapes the entire defensive structure. One practical consequence of this is that the defender in an endgame should not overextend resources guarding against threats that are not yet concrete. This sounds like a middle game principle, and in some ways it is, but it applies with more force in the endgame, because the cost of misallocating a piece is higher. If a piece is tied to a speculative defensive duty in the middle game, other pieces can often compensate. In the endgame, there are no other pieces. Defending against a real threat and defending against an imaginary one look similar from the outside, but they produce completely different outcomes. The discipline required is to identify which threats are direct and concrete, address those with care, and resist the instinct to fortify against everything at once. Simplification belongs in this conversation too. When the defender is under pressure and short of space. Trading pieces can reduce the opponent's attacking capacity and bring the position closer to a draw. This is not a new idea, but its application in the endgame is more deliberate. With fewer pieces remaining, each trade reshapes the entire defensive structure rather than adjusting one part of it. This is a tool the defender should keep in mind, not as a reflex, but as a deliberate option when the resulting position after the trade is genuinely more defensible than the one before it. In the endgame, that question carries more weight than it did earlier. The board after the trade is the board you will be defending for the rest of the game. In the endgame, defensive thinking is about precision. Precision in king placement. Precision in pawn management. Precision in identifying which threats are real and which are not. The margin for error is smaller, the consequences of each decision are more permanent, and the tools available are fewer. A player who carries middle game instincts into the endgame without adjusting them will find that the habits which kept them safe earlier in the game are now the source of the problem. Chapter 13. Rook Endgame Defense, the Philidor Position, and Passive Rook Containment. Rook and pawn endgames are among the most common endgame types you will encounter in practice. They are also among the most technically demanding to defend. The principles established in the previous chapter give you the right orientation. The king must be active, pawn weaknesses carry permanent weight, and eliminating losing chances is the priority over merely surviving a crisis. What this chapter adds is a specific and concrete technique for applying those principles in the most frequently occurring defensive scenario. One side has a rook and a passed pawn, and the other side has only a rook. The technique has a name, a precise set of conditions, and a failure mode that is just as important to understand as the technique itself. The good news is that this ending is theoretically drawable in most cases. The bad news is that drawing it requires precise technique, and the most important technique has a name, the Philidor position. Section 1. The Philidor position. Conditions, logic, and how to reach it. The Philidor defense is built around a specific piece arrangement, and understanding it means understanding each structural requirement separately before putting them together. The defending king belongs directly in front of the passed pawn. Not beside it, not behind it. In front of it, blocking its path to promotion. This is the king's active role in this ending, and it is consistent with the broader endgame principle that the king must participate rather than stand aside. The defending rook belongs on the third rank, placed horizontally across the board. Its job at this stage is to cut off the attacking king, not to chase the pawn. The attacking side needs their king to advance and support the pawn's promotion. The third rank rook prevents that by creating a barrier the attacking king cannot cross without walking into check. So the picture is this: the defending king in front of the pawn, the defending rook on the third rank holding the attacking king back. As long as this configuration holds, and the pawn has not yet reached the sixth rank, the position is a theoretical draw. The critical moment comes when the pawn does advance to the sixth rank. At that point, the third rank defense is no longer viable. The attacking king can now use the sixth rank itself, and the rook's horizontal barrier loses its effectiveness. This is when the defending rook must abandon the third rank and shift to the back rank, delivering long-distance checks from behind the pawn. The logic is that the attacking king now needs to shelter from those checks, and doing so costs tempos that prevent smooth coordination between the king and pawn. The timing of this transition is everything. If the defending rook moves to the back rank too early, before the pawn has actually reached the sixth rank, the third rank barrier is given up without cause. The attacking king advances freely, and the position deteriorates faster than it should. If the rook stays on the third rank too long after the pawn has crossed to the sixth, the attacking king settles into a dominant position, and the checks from behind become insufficient. A common amateur mistake reinforces this point. Many players instinctively place the defending rook behind the pawn, reasoning that rooks belong behind passed pawns. That principle applies to the attacking side. For the defender, placing the rook behind the pawn too early surrenders the third rank barrier and removes the one tool that restrains the attacking king. The correct default for the defender is the third rank, not behind the pawn, until the pawn forces the transition. Reaching the Philidor position in a real game requires recognizing it as the target early enough to steer toward it. The defending king needs to get in front of the pawn before it advances too far. The defending rook needs to claim the third rank before the attacking king crosses it. Both of these require anticipatory thinking rather than reactive adjustment. If you wait until the pawn is already on the fifth or sixth rank to begin organizing the Philidor structure, you will often find that one of the two requirements is already unachievable. Section 2. When the Philidor fails. Recognizing positions that require different defenses. The Philidor defense is a drawing technique, not a universal solution. Knowing when it cannot be reached is as important as knowing how to execute it. The clearest signal that the Philidor is unavailable is the defending king being cut off. If the attacking rook places itself on a rank or file that separates the defending king from the pawn's path, the king cannot get in front of the pawn. Without the king in front of the pawn, the first structural requirement of the Philidor is already missing. No amount of rook maneuvering compensates for that. The second signal is pawn advancement. Once the attacking pawn has safely reached the sixth rank, with the attacking king in support, the Philidor drawing method becomes very difficult to execute, and in many positions is no longer available at all. The attacking side is close enough to promotion that the defender's options are severely restricted, regardless of where the rook sits. If the attacking king advances in front of its pawn, while the defending king is cut off, the position begins to resemble what endgame theory calls a Lucena position. In the Lucena, the attacking king is on the seventh rank in front of its pawn, the attacking rook controls the eighth rank, and the defending rook is cut off from the pawn. That is one of the most well-known winning structures for the stronger side, and once it is fully reached, the defender is generally fighting a lost battle regardless of technique. Rook-pawn positions add a further complication. When the pawn is on the A-file or H-file, the board edge restricts the defending rook's checking distance along the rank. Some positions that would be drawn with a central pawn become lost with a rook pawn, because the defending king can be stalemated, or the rook loses its ability to check from sufficient distance along the shorter side of the board. The stalemate motif can sometimes appear as a saving resource in these positions, but it requires specific piece placement and cannot be assumed. The practical decision point is this: before committing to Philidor-based thinking, assess whether both requirements are still achievable. Can the defending king reach the square in front of the pawn? Can the defending rook claim the third rank before the attacking king crosses it? If either answer is no, continuing to aim for the Philidor wastes tempos that could be spent on an alternative defensive resource. Choosing the wrong method at this fork is not a minor inefficiency. In rook endgames, a single wasted tempo can be the difference between a draw and a loss. Section 3. Passive rook containment and the art of checking from distance. When the Philidor position is unavailable, the primary defensive resource becomes checking from a distance. This is more than a desperate last resort. It is an active technique with its own logic and its own conditions for success. The core idea is that the attacking king needs to shelter from checks. Every time it does, it loses a tempo. Those lost tempos slow the coordination between the attacking king and pawn, and in a race between promotion and the defending side's ability to hold, tempo is everything. A rook that is delivering repeated checks from a distance is not being wasted. It is consuming the attacker's time and disrupting their plan. For this technique to work, the defending rook needs space. Specifically, it needs enough distance from the attacking king that the king cannot simply step toward the rook and drive it away in one move. Endgame theory emphasizes maintaining this checking distance as a key drawing resource. When the rook is close enough for the attacking king to approach and threaten it, the checks stop being free and the technique breaks down. Checking from behind the pawn is generally more effective than checking from the side, particularly when the pawn has reached the 7th rank. Lateral checks from the side allow the attacking king to shelter by stepping in front of the pawn, cutting off the checking angle. Checks from behind force the king to move along the rank, which tends to be more disruptive to the attacker's coordination. Passive rook containment is the broader category that checking from distance belongs to. The principle is keeping the rook on open files or ranks, where it can harass the attacking king and prevent smooth coordination between the king and pawn. A rook that is only checking, only harassing, only making the attacker uncomfortable, is doing exactly what the position requires. The aim is not to win material, but to consume enough of the attacker's tempos that promotion cannot be smoothly achieved. The distinction between a drawing technique and a merely delaying one comes down to whether the harassment is sufficient to neutralize the pawn's advance entirely, or only slow it. That depends on the exact placement of all 4 pieces. There is no fixed rank distance that guarantees a draw. What the defender is assessing is whether the rook has enough room to keep checking without being trapped or driven to a passive square. What connects the Philidor technique, the transition to back-rank checks, and passive rook containment is a single evaluative discipline. Each method has specific conditions, and those conditions must be assessed honestly before committing to any of them. In rook endgames, the questions are always concrete. Can the king reach the square in front of the pawn? Can the rook claim the 3rd rank before the attacking king crosses it? Does the rook have enough space to check from distance without being cornered? A player who answers those questions before moving, rather than after the position has already deteriorated, is the one who holds difficult rook endings. A player who applies the right technique to the wrong position loses just as surely as one who applies no technique at all. Chapter 14. Defending against the isolated queen's pawn. Structural pressure over time. Defending against the isolated queen's pawn requires a complete blueprint built across several connected ideas, each one preparing the ground for the next. Instead of a single technique applied at the right moment, this challenge demands a broader strategic approach. The isolated queen's pawn is one of the most common structural imbalances you will encounter. It appears across many opening systems, and it always creates the same basic tension. The side with the pawn gets real, concrete advantages in the middle game, and pays a real, concrete structural price in the endgame. Understanding both sides of that trade is where the defensive blueprint begins. That isolation is the defining feature. Whatever support the pawn gets has to come from pieces, and that creates a permanent obligation. But the isolation also creates something the pawn-owning side values: open lines. Without pawns on the k and e files, rooks can operate on those half-open files immediately. The d file behind the pawn becomes a natural home for a rook. The central space the pawn occupies, sitting on the 4th or 5th rank, gives the attacker a real foothold in the middle of the board. So before thinking about how to defend, it helps to see clearly what the attacker actually has. They typically have a rook on the d-file behind the pawn, another rook pressing on the key, or e-file, and pieces placed to use the central space. A knight on e5, supported by the d4 pawn, occupies the standard central outpost. Bishops developed along active diagonals, sometimes aimed at the enemy king, are common. Queens placed on d3 or e2 support both the pawn and potential kingside threats. The whole setup is oriented toward generating piece activity that compensates for the pawn's structural cost. And in the middle game, with all those pieces coordinated and the positions still complex, that compensation is real. The attacker can generate genuine pressure, and the defender who does not understand the structure can feel overwhelmed before the pawn's weakness ever becomes relevant. This is the first thing to understand clearly. The isolated queen's pawn is not simply a weakness. In the middle game, it is a dynamic asset. It grants space, open lines, active piece placement, and the constant threat of a pawn advance to d5. The pawn is a liability and an engine at the same time, and the balance between those two qualities shifts as pieces come off the board. That shift is the core of the defensive strategy. As pieces are exchanged, the attacker's compensation shrinks. The open files matter less when there are fewer pieces to use them. The knight outpost loses its bite when there is no queen to coordinate with it. The kingside attack dissolves when the attacking pieces are gone. What remains, once the middle game complexity clears, is the structural fact: a pawn with no pawn neighbors, sitting on an open file, unable to defend itself. In the endgame, that pawn is a permanent target. It ties down whatever pieces remain to its defense. It gives the opponent a fixed point to attack, and it cannot be fixed by tactics or activity, because the complications that masked it are no longer there. This is the defender's fundamental orientation. Time is on your side. The structural weakness does not disappear. It grows more significant with every piece that leaves the board. The attacker's advantage is front-loaded, concentrated in the middle game, when their pieces are active and the position is rich with threats. The defender's advantage is backloaded, accumulating quietly and becoming decisive when the position simplifies. That orientation has a practical consequence that matters immediately. A common defensive error is to play too passively in the early middle game, trying to hunker down and wait for the endgame. The problem is that this approach hands the attacker exactly what they need: time to build piece activity, coordinate their forces, and generate threats before the pawn's weakness ever becomes relevant. If the defender simply absorbs pressure without creating any counter demands, the attacker can pile up attackers, launch kingside operations, and potentially win before the structural weakness ever becomes the deciding factor. The correct approach is not passive waiting. It is active, purposeful defense that keeps the position from becoming one-sided while the defender works towards simplification on favorable terms. The defender needs to be doing something the attacker has to account for, not just absorbing blows. That means piece activity, control of key squares, and deliberate management of what gets traded and what stays on the board. The blockade square is the most important single square in these positions. If the attacker can advance the pawn through it, they open the position and activate their pieces further. If the defender can place a piece on it and keep it there, the pawn is frozen, unable to advance or exchange itself, sitting as a permanent structural liability. A piece planted on that square, ideally a knight, becomes the anchor of the entire defensive structure. Controlling that square is not simply one idea among several. It is the central organizing goal of the defense. The attacker naturally works to prevent this. Bishops develop to active diagonals, pieces placed on c3 or e3, and queen placements on d3 or e2 are all partly aimed at contesting the blockade square and keeping the pawn mobile. The defender's task is to fight for that square early, before the attacker's pieces fully coordinate around it. There is also a subtler structural point worth understanding. The absence of pawns on the Ka and e-files does not only create open lines for the attacker, it also reduces the attacker's control over certain key squares. Without a c-pawn, the squares on the c-file and around c4 and c5 are more accessible to the defender's pieces. Without an e-pawn, the e4 and e5 squares are similarly available. Recognizing this, a defender can use those squares productively, placing pieces where the attacker's pawn structure cannot easily challenge them. The endgame transition is where the defender's patience pays off. Once queens come off the board and the major attacking potential disappears, the isolated pawn shifts from a dynamic asset to a static liability. The defending side can attack it from the front, from the side, and from behind, with rooks, while the pawn-owning side's pieces are tied to its defense. A stable blockade on the square in front of the pawn, combined with rook pressure on the pawn itself, is typically enough to win the pawn or force the pawn-owning side into a passive, losing structure. The key condition for that endgame to be decisive is that the blockade is already established before the transition happens. Reaching the endgame without a piece on the critical blockade square means losing the structural thread. The pawn can potentially advance, activate the position, and give the attacker new resources. The blockade has to be built in the middle game, while the defender is also managing piece activity and avoiding tactical disasters. What this means practically is that the defender is running two parallel tasks throughout the middle game. The first is active enough defense to prevent the attacker from generating overwhelming piece activity. The second is the steady construction of the blockade and the preparation for a favorable endgame. Neither task can be ignored in favor of the other. Balancing these tasks ensures the defender remains competitive throughout the game.